I would like us to move to the second part of this session, and this is we will briefly explain what we have done so far. So we have run several innovation laboratories. We started with the previous festival. Ask your suggestion, your interest, your commitment to help us to develop those innovation laboratories. And based on your input, we pick up 3 of them. And those laboratories have been working over the period of 6, 7, 8 months. Collecting the evidence, presenting the business case, and so on. And we have now a series of short presentation of the preliminary result of those laboratories. So, right. Then I would invite our speakers to join me here. And that's JoAnne, Swenja, and I think Max. Max is going to present, right. So the order is up to you. Perhaps, JoAnne, would you like to start? And yeah.
Oh, does it work? There we go. Okay. Okay. So great. It's great. I've met all of you, most of you on the bus and giving you badges. It's a great group. I've had already some super conversations. So it's a real pleasure. It's a real pleasure. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here and present. Okay, I'm presenting our first innovation lab titled Harnessing Insurance to Promote Nature-Based Solutions for Wildfire Risk Management. So we've gone to wildfires here. And I'm presenting also on a part, of course, of our IASA team, as you see the names here. And I should also say that we did this innovation lab in very close collaboration with the Fire Log project, for which we also are participating in. And I should also say to Amy here that we also harvested a lot of insights that we had gained from the Fusicos project, which actually implemented nature-based solutions. Okay, our core question that we asked in this lab was, how can insurance enable wildfire nature-based solutions? And we found that that question was actually at the nexus of 3 actually quite challenging questions. One is, what is in fact the wildfire insurance landscape? And particularly, we look particularly in the EU and particularly at the Mediterranean countries. We also asked, and this was really challenging, what are nature-based solutions for wildfire? And the third question we looked at is how, in fact, can insurance enable nature-based solutions? And of course, that's the topic of NATURANCE and why many of you are here. So that, of course, was very core to this question. And I'm going to go through each of these questions to tell you and then come to a few, hopefully, results of our lab. First, let me just tell you who we were. All in all, we were 40 plus expert participants. This was not a stakeholder. This was an expert working group, the lab. As you can see here, I won't read through them, but we were a good mix of scientists, from ecologists to insurers, all the way to, of course, fire researchers and so on. We had several in-person meetings. Actually, the last one took place yesterday. And of course, some virtual meetings. We've done quite a few webinars. We're working on, and although the lab is finished, it was so exciting. We're continuing work, and of course, want to get out some white papers, policy briefs, and of course, some journal and book publications. And we invite anybody to join who has an interest. I'm going to turn to this first question that we looked at, and what is the wildfire insurance landscape? And it's not a surprise to you if I say wildfire risk is increasing due mainly to climate change and, of course, urbanization. The WMO predicts that the number of extreme fires globally will grow 30% by 2050, with losses to lives, property, health. You might be surprised to hear that 5 to 8% of premature deaths from air pollution is actually attributed to wildfire smoke. And of course, risk to ecosystems. There's multiple fire types and contexts. The picture, of course, shows a forest fire, but there's bush fires, shrub fires, grass fires. Globally, 50% of wildfires are grass fires. Peat, vegetation. Many, of course, and this is the complication, take place in what's called the urban or the wildland-urban interface. Wildfire insurance. Okay, compared with earthquakes, storms, and floods, wildfire losses have counted for the smallest share of economic losses. Actually, it's not a big picture number on insurance agendas. But it has the highest level of insurance coverage, mainly because fires are in most property insurance policies and covers wildfires. However, there are insurance gaps, and particularly in Europe. In fact, the largest insurance gap is expected in Europe, where there are diverse, and I don't have time to go into them, but there's very diverse private and public systems that cover wildfire, but none of which explicitly encourage nature-based solutions. So there's our big challenge. So from that, I will tell you, okay, what our innovation lab, it actually explored ways to close this gap. For example, one important example was maybe to provide a backup to national insurers by revising the European Union Solidarity Fund that could serve, it could potentially serve as a reinsurer for national systems, and at the same time, impose those conditions that we need for disaster risk reduction. You might be surprised it doesn't impose any conditions now, and also for nature-based solutions. Okay, now I'm going to turn to that second question. I don't know why the colors disappeared here, but what are nature-based solutions for wildfire? I don't need to tell this crowd, I don't need to read this crowd the IUCN definition. You all, I think most of you here know it. But I would like to direct your attention to the fact that biodiversity is, of course, core. It has a necessary condition. It has to enhance biodiversity. And that actually is important when it comes to looking at what is a nature-based solution for wildfire. And I can tell you there's pretty strong agreement on what is not a nature-based solution for wildfire. And here you see the suppression methods that we have to put them out. We're very good at putting them out, in fact. And most of the funding, nationally and in the European Commission, goes here. And in fact, this has prompted Marsh McLennan to call this the firefighting trap, in which spiraling fire suppression costs consume budget for investment in fire prevention, therefore contributing to increased fire risks. There's actually less agreement on what is a nature-based solution for wildfire. The kind of mainstream thought on this comes from the ecological forest management community. And they say, okay, we've got to thin forests. We've got to keep the fuel load down with grazing. Here you see goats. Controlled burns, really important. And of course, mixed forests. But this narrative is coming under increasing challenge from an emerging sort of conservation biodiversity narrative in wildfire management. And it is saying, among many other things, I'm simplifying, of course, that we need what's being called ecological thinning. And that means you don't pull the lumber out and sell it, you let it lie on the forest ground. And in fact, the renaturalization law is actually encouraging that as well. That's a big difference. Instead of putting your domestic animals out there, many are calling for actually rewilding, bringing back the wild. I put this in parentheses, culturally controlled burns. Controlled burns are very controversial in both communities, actually. But we're saying if you do them very sparingly and maybe mimic those practices of long-term indigenous peoples, because they seem to have, there seems to be a idea that they carry them out much more or much more nature-oriented. Mixed forests, again, outside of the WI, maybe let it burn. Actually, fires are really important for ecosystems. And I think this might be the most important nature-based solution: limit development. We've got to keep more nature out there. So, yeah. So then your forest looks more like this. And you might notice from all of what I just said that most wildfire nature-based solutions, no matter what narrative you're in, they're carried out at the community scale, not the household. And our innovation lab explored community-based insurance schemes for the European Union. For example, like the National Flood Insurance Program community rating system in the US. And at some point, we actually asked, are actually public monopolies in terms of insurance better suited for nature-based solutions? A question on the table. Okay, I'm going to turn now to the very last question we posed. How do we use insurance for nature-based solutions? And here we put together a taxonomy of activities that insurers can take, both in their underwriting pillar and also in their investment pillar. And I'm going to go through a few of these, just how they relate to wildfire. I don't have time to give all the examples that I would like to give, but I'll give you a few just to give you a flavor of this. First, we can, insurers can, first I should say it's color-coded. It's color-coded. The green means it's pretty consistent with the current insurance business model. In other words, they can get revenues, make money doing the green ones, and we can expect those to scale up. The yellow ones are kind of maybes, but probably we're going to need some outside intervention. We're going to need some regulation or maybe some strong impact investor pressure. And the red ones, I think we're just really not sure. We're really not sure. Can we do those with the insurance company? And so I'll try to give you some examples here. First, insure natural capital. Well, our iconic case now, and I look at Jamie here, our iconic case has been insuring coral reefs, where insurers have really designed some very innovative products that are being carried out across the world. Willis, and I point to Jamie, has been Willis, WTW, I suppose we say now, has been a real forerunner in this. But we could also kind of take the analogy maybe to forests, to protect carbon offsets against wildfire. And I just point to this product in Australia where Descartes insurers are protecting carbon credit offsets with a parametric bushfire product, payout triggered by wildfire, utilizing satellite imagery to detect burnt areas and bushfire severity. But they don't actually, this product does not actually encourage the kinds of nature-based solutions we're talking about earlier. But could it? That's a question put on the table. Could it? Could insurers put conditions for eligibility to purchase these products? For example, that these forests would have to be managed in such a way to encourage nature-based solutions. So our innovation lab really picked up on the fact that parametric products are gaining a great deal of attention, not just in wildfire, also in Europe. And we explored how they can incentivize nature-based solutions and regulations to, frankly, make their pricing a bit more transparent. Okay, let's go to another example, de-risk nature-based solutions. First off, we heard this morning about mass timber buildings, and John Schellenhuber said a problem is insurance, but we'll need insurance. We'll need insurance to de-risk these buildings or they won't happen. Insurance is incredibly important here. And I'll take you now to wildfire. A prescribed burn by Colorado's Department of Natural Resources destroyed 22 homes and killed 3 persons. It got out of control. The compensation paid was $18 million. This kind of thing puts off a lot of private practitioners for prescribed burns. And you can of course de-risk them, but until recently there was no liability insurance for prescribed burns, at least not in the US. But a new carrier, Forest Specialty Underwriters, along with Lloyd's of London, has put out now a product, however, with very low limits on that. I won't read it, but you can see. So, of course, we have to ask, is our prescribed burns a nature-based solution? And what should, in fact, insurers be in de-risking? And they have huge power, of course, because if you don't de-risk these things, they won't happen. So they have choices to make, decide, is this something you want to encourage? Okay, so you can read this. Okay, I'm going to move on now to a couple of yellows here. And I'm going to take you again to the US and to California. And how can we incentivize MBS or decline cover for nature negative projects? And there's a lot of potential here. And a study by the Nature Conservancy and WTW showed that ecological forestry, which I understand is now being called forestry treatment because it's not so sure that it's that ecological. Thinning and controlled burns in California's French Meadows National Forest could lead to a decrease in insurance premiums by a whopping 41%. Well, then you say, well, these residents put pressure on these national forest managers to actually carry out these practices. Very powerful thing that insurers can actually do. You can also discourage development with high premiums or actually insurance withdrawal. And fire insurance in California and much of Europe is actually required for a mortgage. High premiums will greatly discourage building in high-risk areas and could even lead to retreat. Again, it's a very powerful instrument that insurers have to actually encourage nature-based solutions. Just as an aside, let me just tell you a little bit about the state of the California market. First, insurers are required to write now a portion of their policies in high-risk areas if they stay in the state. Some of them are not staying in the state. They can, and this is new because they couldn't before, they can take climate change into account in setting premiums. And in contrast to Europe, in California, the regulators play a huge role in premium setting. That doesn't happen in Europe. We could start asking, actually, why not? State Farm, the largest insurer, has announced it will not renew, it announced this already on March 29th, 24, it will not renew 72,000 policies, so it's kind of moving out. And others are raising premiums and reducing cover. A huge, huge incentive not to build in high-risk areas. So, requiring or allowing insurers to differentiate pricing may prove critical for DRR and NBS in California, and our lab explored the potential and feasibility of requiring differentiated pricing in the EU. You might be surprised to hear that most insurers do not differentiate their pricing according to risk. Swenja, you may disagree, but at least my experience shows that. Okay, I'm going to move to the second pillar. I have very little time left, but that's okay because it's going to take much time because there isn't a lot happening in the investment pillar. Of course, the three things we have listed here are, you will recognize, of course, they're all part of the ESG agenda, particularly the big E part of the ESG agenda. And, we see first, that donations, that was mentioned already by Stefan this morning, donations, Aviva is moving in a big way to donating in all kinds of nature positive investments in the UK. It's a very positive development, but we put it in yellow because there's a little bit of a question of how far can that go. Then the two, I think, biggies, I think these are the really biggies of what could be done to really push for a nature positive economy. And we put them in pink. They're not quite red, but we're worried. And that's investing directly in nature-based solutions. I don't think that's been said now over and over again today. Most nature is a public good. It's not very good for investments. And I think it's an illusion to think that insurers or any portfolio managers are going to go in a big way into investing in nature-based solutions. Nature negative investment means divesting out of nature negative. We're not seeing it yet. Of course, there's some steps moving it in that direction, and I'll end, of course, with this, is the task force on nature-related financial disclosures is, of course, published its recommendations, how insurers address nature-related risk and opportunities by identifying, assessing, managing, and where appropriate, disclosing nature-related issues. It is the cornerstone of the EU Sustainable Finance Framework. And what our innovation lab was asking, or noting, of course, that it's important, but not yet a game changer. The lab is exploring how to strengthen it, for example, by making it mandatory, it's voluntary, and or reforms, for example, to the Solvency II directive and others. I think there's a lot of reforms that can be made that go beyond disclosing, but to requiring these kinds of activities. So it's pink. We'll see. Okay, I'm going to close this last slide that's kind of summarize some ideas that emerged from our innovation lab. These I put in terms of questions because, frankly, we don't have complete consensus. And they're questions I think that we really need to explore in a serious way. First, should regulators, I think we need to strengthen regulation in Europe. Should regulators require compulsory adoption of TNFD recommendations? Should they require insurance to differentiate premiums to reflect DRR and particularly NBS? Should they require more transparency in insurance pricing, particularly parametric products? Should the European Commission and member states extend the EUSF to provide subsidized reinsurance to member states that take DRR and NBS measures? Should they enable public community insurance programs, for example, by re-examining the 2009 EU directive abolishing public monopolies? Should they reform the Solvency II directive to assure that investment policies reflect biodiversity goals of the European Union? So, thank you.
Thanks so much for this. I think it was really interesting. We should really hear more about the links between nature-based solutions and wildfire. And we will. We're going to have this afternoon discussions, after lunch. So please keep tuned and join if you want to discuss more with JoAnne and her team. So now I'm going to invite Max. Max is going to talk about flood risk.
I'll be doing this presentation together with Guillermo García, who's my colleague at the Institute for Environmental Studies in Amsterdam. And he will actually, there's no pretty picture of you there, unfortunately.
Yeah, sure. Hello. Okay. Okay, yeah. Okay, so Max and I are here today to talk about our innovation lab, which we finished. We had the last session about 2 months ago. And we're focusing on improving the methods for assessing nature-based solutions for climate risk, both from the risk reduction perspective, but also the societal co-benefits. And is there a clicker? Oh, yeah, okay. So yeah, I will not go into much detail, obviously, on what nature-based solutions are, but maybe in the case of flooding, it would be quite interesting. In the case that we're looking at here, we have like traditional measures on the top part and some nature-based solutions integrated in the bottom part, such as floodplains, which can enhance infiltration to reduce flood risk, or you have some urban green as well, wetlands, then you can also like remeandering of the river. There are many different ways to reduce flood risk in the context of flooding. And the question we're asking ourselves is, how effective are nature-based solutions in reducing flood risk, and how can this impact in insurance premiums and insurability, which Max will explain, the recent developments we've done with some of the modeling in-house at IBM, at the Institute for Environmental Studies. And then we will also discuss the co-benefits, which we will assess through like a choice experiment, and we will go into more detail in a bit. Of course, there's still some challenges, as Stephen and Flora have also mentioned, and also JoAnne now, about coordinating private and public investment in nature-based solutions, and how the private sector might be interested more in the risk reduction, and it's not clear that without the co-benefits, this could be proven worthy investments. But we will go into that into a second. First, I will briefly summarize how the structure of our innovation lab. We had a first session in November at the headquarters of the Dutch Association of Insurers, which we set up the societal problem, and we invited them to collaborate in the 2 following sessions. The first one was on flood risk reduction potential of nature-based solutions. So we invited mainly insurers and climate risk modelers, flood risk modelers that we had in-house at IBM as well. And we discussed how these models can be useful for insurers, to what extent they were used to the current developments that we were proposing. We had some representatives from ASR, Dutch Division of Insurers, Achmea, which is a Dutch insurer, and also Rabobank. And the last session, since we were going to focus on the co-benefits, we wanted to invite also representatives from the public sector, the Water Directorate. And these are all based in Limburg, which is the case study that we're using to apply the improved methods when we finish the development. We had, just to mention, we had around 50 stakeholders in total from these 3 sessions, from many different backgrounds and expertise. So I didn't know. Okay, there we go. So the case study is the European floods of 2021, which happened in July, and they occur after a period of extreme rainfall that mainly affected, was started in the UK, but then mainly affected Germany and also the Netherlands, Belgium. You can see that in the map here, but also reached all the way to Poland. They had devastating effects, particularly, as I mentioned previously, in Germany, but also the Netherlands in the region of Limburg, which is the region we will focus on for our case study. It also had a major impact, and we can see, based on a paper published in 2023, around 350 to 600 million of damage, of which around 200 million were insured. So we will apply our new developed models and the choice experiment for the non-market valuation in this region. And now, Max, we will go a bit more in detail into the nature-based solutions and the flood risk reduction.
Yeah, thanks, Guillermo. So one of the difficulties of investing in nature-based solutions against flood risk is, compared to the traditional gray infrastructure, is the uncertainty of the actual risk reduction. So that is, part of our innovation lab is about improving this, these assessments. And I will present some of the ongoing work on these flood risk assessments. So in the figure on the left is shown the basic framework of assessing flood risk, a riverine flood risk, and how nature-based solutions could fit into that assessment. So we start with, on the top left, with a rainfall recurrence model. So this is some probabilistic model that assesses, with certain probabilities, what is the amount of rainfall. A hydrological model assesses the extent to which that water accumulates into the river. So how much does the river rise? And this involves digital elevation, for example, but also the amount of vegetation that is in the way, and that increases, for example, the infiltration. After we know how much the river level will rise due to rainfall, a inundation model or a hydrodynamic model is used to assess, if this flows down the river and the water accumulates more, then at some point it may exceed the natural or the man-made embankments, causing a flood. This model assesses to what extent does this flood the land, what is the depth, what is the velocity of the water as it flows through the land. So that is the biophysical side of flooding, the hazard side. But then, of course, we also need to look at the social side. So then we look at exposure, how much a built environment or economic value is in the way of the flood. And vulnerability captures to what extent is the exposed assets impacted by inundation. And then you end up with, on the bottom there, a curve with certain probabilities. What is so probabilities of rainfall occurrence? What are the impacts on the built environment? And how does nature-based solutions fit into this? That is also shown here in this illustrative example. So we see two scenarios, one where there's continued deforestation. And in that scenario, water flows more quickly down into the river because there's less obstacles, and there's also less, infiltration into the soil is less than, for example, of course, built environment, but also agricultural land. And another scenario where there is, the forest is kept. In this example, it shows that on the bottom there, you can see there's a positive impact. So for each probability of rainfall, there's a lower impact. Okay, so that is just an illustrative example. What we are focusing on, so together with stakeholders and policymakers in Limburg, so the area that was flooded in the Netherlands, we're developing scenarios of nature-based solutions that are effective. So this involves a range of different measures. So as can also be seen in the first figure that Guillermo showed, a successful strategy of nature-based solutions to reduce flood risk is not a single measure, but it involves a lot of different measures, preferably also throughout the river basin, so not in a particular location. So we're developing scenarios that are effective in this particular river system in the Netherlands. So we're considering storage ponds. So these are areas that are allowed to be overflowed in the case of high river levels, reducing the impact downstream. A change of agricultural land to grassland or other types of wild areas to increase the infiltration. And then floodplain restoration or remeandering. And these are measures in the riverbeds themselves, which increase essentially the roughness, or it reduces essentially the speed of the water when water levels are high. And that also reduces the impact downstream. So how do we integrate this into the modeling framework? So we have a hydrological model called CWAT-M. There we can model changes in land use, for example, changes of agricultural land to grasslands, and changing infiltration parameters. Also, we update the hydrodynamic model Sphinx, also with changes in land use, for example, to increase the riverbeds, so to remove the dikes and place them a bit further out, giving more space for wild areas in the riverbeds. That changes for what's called a Manning's coefficient. So that's the roughness indicator that impacts the velocity of the water. Okay, so that's all to do with the biophysical side or the hazard side of flooding, but also we need to look at the social side. So the effectiveness, well, assessing the effectiveness of nature-based solutions to reduce risk. In order to have a more comprehensive overview of this, we need to consider also changes in exposure and vulnerability. And this is also useful for insurance sector when we, for example, want insurance to more accurately price risk, risk-based premiums, for example, and also to reduce uncertainty, increase the insurability of flood risk. So there are, well, a traditional approach to modeling exposure and vulnerability is through a raster-based approach, and that is shown at the top. And we are working instead on developing a vector-based approach for this, which is shown in the bottom. So first on the top, flood risk is a product of hazard, exposure, vulnerability. So we start on the left with a hazard map, and this will include nature-based solutions. Then we overlay that with an exposure map, and this involves some kind of land use classifications. Often the Korean land use map is used, which is shown there, so that, certain areas are allocated with a certain function, a built environment, infrastructure, agriculture, etc. And then stage damage curves are used, which is shown down on the top right, which give the relationship between inundation and damage. And this is also for each of the different land uses. And you can see this is quite an aggregated approach. So for the entire built environment, there's one curve. So you can see that there is some uncertainty because, of course, there are differences in buildings and vulnerability also in terms of flooding. So therefore, we are increasing the accuracy of this approach with a vector-based approach. So on the bottom, we show, so we start with the same inundation map, but we overlay that with an object-based data set. And that's shown here. So in the Netherlands, we have quite a nice database that includes information on building level, so about the function of the building, the worth, but also the building year, for example, construction materials. And ideally, this would also include some information on specific flood vulnerability, whether certain adaptation measures have been taken, for example. And then, of course, we also need to include more detailed vulnerability information that includes information on these adaptation measures, for example, and that some of my colleagues have been working on. So that's shown here on the right. So this is just for the built environment. You can see that there is quite a lot of variation actually in the vulnerability of different buildings, and particularly how certain risk reduction measures impact vulnerability. And this is also based on empirical data obtained after the flood in Limburg in 2021. Okay, so some preliminary conclusions. Nature-based solutions for flood risk reduction require upstream cooperation. So this is one of the challenges, whereas with gray infrastructure like levees or dikes, you can protect a certain area from flooding. That is not the case with nature-based solutions because you need application throughout the river basin in order for the strategy to be effective. So therefore, we need application on ideally the river basin level. A role for insurers is to accurately assess flood risk with nature-based solutions and adjust the premium. So one of the issues with nature-based solutions is the valuation of the benefits. One of the ways that insurers can contribute is to accurately price this and to make it explicit for people living in the area, what is the benefit through a reduction in premiums. Nature-based solutions improves insurability and reduces premiums. With this approach, it reduces also the uncertainty, but also the extreme impacts which cause flood risk to be uninsurable in some areas will ideally be prevented. And finally, public nature of nature-based solutions, but also due to the coordination problem, likely requires a very strong public investment and coordination role, particularly for nature-based solutions for river and flood risk. Yeah.
Okay, yes. First of all, if that graph sounds familiar, it's maybe because Stephen just used it like 2 hours ago. But yeah, so it's the same. I think it's for a different nature-based solution actually. But yeah, exactly. Yeah. So from the co-benefit side, I think this has already been repeated before as well. If we look at the risk reduction alone, it's possible that nature-based solution and the degree of uncertainty and also like the time horizon that maybe they take until they realize the full risk reduction benefits, they may not seem as appealing. So from a more societal perspective, we look into what other co-benefits, simultaneous benefits do they bring to the wider society. And yeah, as we can see, for example, in this graph, which is for an urban nature-based solution, once we add, I think it's just an example, but once we add all of the different co-benefits, we get a positive, we get actually net benefits. But who is benefiting from this? And if we manage to explain who's benefiting, then maybe we can look into the financing mechanisms between the private and public sector. And that will be one of the key challenges that we are looking into the choice experiment, but then a later social cost benefit analysis that we're planning to do based on the case of Limburg. And as also has been mentioned before, monetizing non-market benefits is usually quite difficult. And it's something that I will explain in a second, because the second part of our innovation lab, we invited some local stakeholders from Limburg, including from the Water Directorate. And we tried to ask them what was important for them and what kind of co-benefits would they consider relevant for if nature-based solutions were to be implemented in Limburg. So the method that we're using and we asked them about is what's known as a choice experiment, which is part of a state preference method for environmental valuation, which basically consists on asking stakeholders about, households about their preferences under different scenarios. So we have a business as usual scenario and 2 different management plans. The 2 different management plans, they come with a different set of benefits, which are in the first column on the left-hand side, which this can be, for example, recreation, improved water quality, tourism opportunities, flood risk reduction, and they will come off at different levels. So each management plan has their own set of benefits at a different level, and they will also associate with a monetary cost. This can be it can be taxes or voluntary contributions. There are many payment vehicles that can be used in choice experiments. So the problem for these choice experiments to work, the levels that we choose for our characteristics under the different scenarios need to be realistic. So we're already using a hypothetical scenario because these nature-based solutions have not been implemented. So we don't know the current preferences because the data doesn't exist in real life. So that's why we use stated preferences. So we need realistic scenarios and realistic levels for each of the different nature-based solutions or hybrid solutions that we will be presenting to the respondents. We've been working with Andrea from KIT also to have like a more of an overview beside us economists about like what different improvements in terms of biodiversity or water quality would we bring with these different, like, for example, floodplain restorations or grassland. So We try to solve these challenges also by asking the people in Limburg what is important for them, and also what kind of disbenefits of nature-based solutions could they come up with, because and they were all very interested in the relationship between land use change and nature-based solution. And in a country like the Netherlands, which is quite small, this will mean like taking land away from agriculture, which can bring other problems, or it will be difficult to do in practice. So we wanted to include also this benefit, which is not quite common in choice experiments in the past, into the trade-off that the respondents will have to make. So if you want to implement this nature-based solution, this amount of hectares of agricultural land will be taken away for restoring a floodplain, for example. Yeah, so we discussed this with the stakeholders, and first of all, they confirmed that the nature-based solutions are being planned in the Limburg area, mostly in combination with traditional solutions, so this kind of hybrid system. Mainly floodplains, storage ponds, remeandering of the river are among the most cited nature-based solutions that could be implemented in the region. And as I mentioned before, land use-related disbenefits were the more relevant for the stakeholders. So they were interested in knowing like what is the impact of this land loss of agriculture, for example, which is the most common type of in the region. And yeah, among the attributes that we highlighted, like they highlighted as most relevant, it was like is the site accessible? Will we be able to enjoy, like go there for walks, bike rides, whatever, like the aesthetic appreciation part of it, water quality, and local climate regulation, which being so small scale nature-based solutions, is quite difficult to know if there are actually like tangible benefits in that regard. But that's what we discussed with Andrea over this past couple of months. So the idea is that we will test this survey in June and see if for example, is it easy to understand for our respondents, though the levels that we chose make sense, also the level of contribution, monetary contribution, and we will launch the survey in September, yeah, and hopefully have results by the end of the year. And to wrap up, so we co-design improved methods for assessing the benefits of nature-based solutions for flood risk reduction, both from the risk reduction and the co-benefit side. So with the new object-based model that Matt presented and the choice experiment taking into account local preferences in the Limburg area and these benefits. And once we have results from these two methods and we implement them in the Limburg region, we will produce a full social societal cost-benefit analysis and try to map who are the beneficiaries and think about potential public-private financing schemes. As we have heard in previous sessions, most likely public, but yeah, we'll try to see, okay, who's going to benefit from this with these new methods that we are developing currently at IBM. And I think that's been it, unless you want to add anything. All right, so thank you very much.
Thanks, Guillermo. Thanks, Max, for presenting the results from your innovation lab. Before we go to the lab that Swenja is going to present, I want to give the chance for the room to ask one, max two questions because of time. And it can relate also to JoAnne's presentation related to wildfire or to flood risk. No? Silence? Oh, there's one. Thank you. And please present yourself before.
Oh, yes, sure. Nidhi Nagabatal from United Nations University Office in Belgium. My questions to most of the panelists is also on the governance side of NBS, primarily the policy coherence, because NBS plugs into several agendas, climate, nature restoration, soil restoration per se, and many others. So what kind of advancements, how do we pitch it for a policy coherence? So all of these mandates are addressed in tandem. Some thoughts, some insights to take home.
Thank you. JoAnne, do you want to comment something on that?
Yeah, I know that coherence is becoming a really important topic in the governance. I know besides what I was talking about today in the Fuzikos project, we did a lot of work on governance for NBS, and especially looking at the enablers and the barriers. And of course, one of the biggest barriers were the silos in governance. And I think, also we see it with the wildfire, what I was presenting today, that we have on the one hand, we will have maybe a European Union Solidarity Fund, which was meant for solidarity and so on, but it hasn't taken into account all the things that it could do because it's a little bit out of its mandate. And, and the people running it, aren't thinking about those things. So trying to get coherence across like Solvency II, across the EUSF, across, there's at least 5 or so different institutions and institutional directives and so on that go across wildfires. And I think, trying to get some polycentric arrangements, some much more is really important. There was one good example, because I don't want to just say, here's the problem. One good example is we were looking at a nature-based solution in Germany, restoring the Isar River. And in fact, we had a group of all the people who had been involved, and I said, what was the most important thing? This took 16 years to get this thing through. And I said, what if you'd taken one thing out, it wouldn't have happened? And they said there was an polycentric working group that went across the water authorities, went across the national authorities, went across about 5 things where they took the young people who really wanted to do this and put them together and I think their coherence goes to that. And they pushed it through, it wouldn't have happened without them. And so, you think, wow, this is what we need. We need more of these kinds of things happening. So thanks for your question. Max, do you want to say something, or even Swenja? Stefan? The important question. Pull you away from your emails. You want me to repeat the question?
Yes, please.
It was about coherence and getting nature-based
And
solutions
policy.
and policy. Yeah.
As I mentioned before, I mean, if we hadn't done awfully silly things just in the last 40 years, never mind 150 years, but just in the last 40 years, we've just gone way too far in landscapes. So even in our childhood, we would have had a lot more nature, a lot more landscapes functioning as retaining areas, right? So it's just that marginal greed in the last 40, 50 years that have really made nature kind of drop off a cliff. Now, what we see as we alluded to before, this whole siloed nature of our administrations is also a major issue. Now, there are attempts in a way to overcome these things. Now, some of you have heard about sort of impact bonds or outcome-based financing. When you hear those words, these are not necessarily innovative financial tools. What in fact they're trying to do is to create innovation in delivery and cooperation. So, for example, you might have in the social impact space, it's recognized really, and obviously that prevention is better than cure, but you need new players, new ways of working across institutions. And they acknowledge that sometimes it's very difficult to do inside institutions. So you actually hire, for example, an NGO or some other entity or corporation to deliver on this and do this coordination work that the public sector actually finds very difficult to do itself. And just at a practical level, I mean, many of our MBS projects start off with a grand vision or a plan or a strategy by a regional authority who states the right intentions, say, want resilience, want climate adaptation, want green city. But really the slog, the hard work is in the 3 years of coordinating the traffic people with the green spaces people. So this silo, this whole way that we're structured, our funding is structured, is really a key bottleneck, but at least it's made on Earth, right? So it's fixable, and what I find is the magic that we're missing sometimes. We've discussed that a lot of this is public sector. Now we tend to think of, rightly so, probably as public sector as being rather rigid and boring and so on. However, every now and again, a miracle pops up. You know, so for example, you know, we supported a project in Wallonia. A water company really went the extra mile to enable the return of the pearl mussel. Did they have to do that? Well, no, actually, you know, minimum compliance avoiding prosecution is a lot cheaper, but they did it. And why did they do it? I mean, this is a public regulated entity. So how come they could do this? Well, look, the owners were fine with it, the region, the utility, well, it's kind of their business to clean up water, and the users were fine with it. So when you start, even within a regulated context, aligning the stakeholders, miracles can happen, in fact. And especially in this area where, to be honest, if we're talking about nature, compliance is a bit of a fuzzy entity. You know, if it's end of pipe compliance, that's very easy to measure and to define, but compliance with environmental nature objectives is actually a bit flexible. So low and high ambition is perfectly possible and accommodatable, even with a regulated context, but it requires this kind of cooperation and communication, and frankly, anything is possible if people are willing to pay for it. So.
Thanks, Stefan, for your perspective. So I'm going to call now Swenja to the stage to talk about the Innovation Lab.
Thank you very much. I know I have a very challenging task because you've been sitting here all patiently. You're probably hungry. I know you have to wait 25 minutes. I am hungry. I know that we're all waiting for lunch. So I'll try and keep this a bit, well, hopefully entertaining. I don't know if, well, it's rather depressing, some of the stuff that we've been hearing. So I liked your comment about the magic. So let's see. I'm not promising that there will be a lot of magic here, but I'll try and be maybe a bit also provocative with some of these statements. So to begin with, first of all, a very big thank you to the organizers, to our hosts here. It's beautiful. I've been here many times, and every time I'm here, it's just lovely. So thank you very much. And for the whole sort of NATURANCE team. You know, it's really exciting. I put this slide up here because sometimes when people ask me, can you come and talk? Then I say, well, what perspective do you want? What hat do you want me to wear? Because I'm wearing different hats. And I hope there's no psychoanalyst in the room that sort of goes into conflicted identities. I don't think I'm conflicted, but I'm just sort of looking at things from very different angles. And that's what I'm trying to do here. So I'll give you some insights into the Innovation Lab that we've been doing at the LSE, where I've actually been wearing two hats. But I think to begin with, and this builds on perfectly, I think, what we just discussed, I thought, let's just revisit a little bit, you know, why projects such as NATURANCE are really important, but also why we always, in all of these discussions, always come to the point where someone says, oh, there needs to be more collaboration and more coordination, and different stakeholders are not joined up. I mean, you've probably all said this, written this, and experienced this. So it's really important. And I would just maybe to begin with, just ask everybody to think in which of these circles they see themselves in. And we can see, you know, who can get most circles there. Just sort of see which of these you would think you've either have worked in or have had experience with. And, you know, I guess we are all individuals, so maybe we can all tick the household box. So I think one is the minimum here. But, you know, anybody would say is very familiar with working with two. More than, maybe let's go to 3. Okay, 4. Ah, okay, that's good. Anybody higher than that? 5? Oh, but yeah, okay, very good. 6? Okay, well, maybe we would go into the sort of boasting or having done various career changes territory. Well, why am I saying this? I think it's really important to revisit this, because in this rather simple or rather complex slide, I mean, there are just some very obvious truths. I mean, we live in a complex world. Nature, I mean, if you think climate is complex, nature is, you know, just a degree higher, complexity higher. And that's like obvious, yeah? And it's also complex because there are lots of different interests at play here and different stakeholders and different actions. And I know we all love talking about the benefits and co-benefits, but there are also trade-offs. And I think what often happens, unfortunately, is that becomes then an issue. So yeah, we can't do it alone, but you know, there's just no common ground. It's too complex. It requires a lot of investment, time investment to actually get everybody lined up. And it becomes like the number one obvious barrier. And then there are cases like what we've just heard, the magic example there, where for some reason, you know, these things seem to be aligned and it works. And I think, you know, that's important to keep in mind. And I have to embrace that, because sometimes I'm getting cynical with this, because I've just been in far too many sessions where, you know, business blamed government, government blamed not having enough data. I mean, even in academia, we were talking over coffee with some economists. I mean, you know, even within different disciplines, you know, we have complete different perspectives and perceptions. So, you know, it's basically just a reminder. And I think it's also just a really key thing that why projects such as NATURANCE are so important. And hopefully to try and disentangle, but also then find some common ground. So I'm going to say a few words about one innovation lab. I mean, we've heard about fire, we've heard about flooding. Would be nice if I would be talking about heat, but I am not. I'm also talking about flooding. And just a big shout out to my colleague, Joy Cara, who can't be here, but who's been coordinating this. And we have actually some of the participants in the room from our innovation lab. So I'll share a few thoughts, and then I think I'll just sort of close by sort of maybe homing in on one of the, well, findings is maybe a bit of an overstatement, but one of the aspects that we've picked up on and where we think there might be some magic in. I'm now really taken on with this magic thing, but there might be something workable in here. So just a very quick, you know, you've heard the term, so I think you're familiar. I'm not sort of going into detail. I think by design, these innovation labs can take very different shapes and forms and, you know, sizes. And I think that is actually good. I mean, there's the overall guidance on how how within NATURANCE we're going to run them. But I think, you know, they also evolve differently. So I think that's actually really beautiful, because I know that purpose of today and tomorrow is also to kick off the next tranche of innovation labs. So, you know, don't feel like what you've heard today, just, you know, that needs to be the way to do it. No, I think there's some guidance, but, you know, also be creative. I think that would be my inspiration. So we did this. It has a UK focus. It has an urban focus, and it looks at flooding. So that's like the starting point. I'm not going to explain, you know, obviously, I think you're all very familiar, flood risk issues. And I'm not even going to explain all the options that exist around nature-based solutions when it comes to urban flooding. But just to say, in my own personal experience, when you talk about this with cities, city officials, often their first thought or response is, we don't have the space to do this. We're in an urban environment, you know, where's the space to do this? You know, and I think that's an important starting point. And Then you unpack it, that there are obviously lots of different issues or different approaches you can do. But I think this whole notion, the mindset, nature, well, that's kind of outside the city. That's dealt with somewhere else. I think that's something we picked up. And so we got together a small group representing different stakeholders. As I said, some are here, and I think you hear from Jonathan later on. And a big shout out to Jonathan. If anybody is interested in gardening, go and talk to Jonathan, because Floodry actually just launched and introduced and showcases a flood resilient garden. And I think this is really nice. We haven't claimed it as a sort of something that was featured in the Innovation Lab, but it's a really interesting example. And I listened to people introducing it to the public yesterday and saying, look, this is a way of how individuals can also help to reduce flood risk in an urban setting. So anyway, go and talk to Jonathan. So, we did the sort of initial problem discovery, problem definition. I mean, I hate to say this, admiring the problem has to be part of that. And I'm not going to run through all of these. There's also a video, I think, that I recorded. Is that right? Is that available somewhere about the Innovation Lab? Yeah, I get thumbs up. So you can read through that or listen to the video at leisure. But it just highlights a couple of key focus areas. And I think this question of the role of insurance, that's obviously an underlying theme. And I guess there the question is, are we talking underwriting? Are we talking risk advice? Are we talking investment? And I think we've been quite open-minded, but maybe just as a reflection to what has been said earlier. I mean, I think the perception of the role of the insurance industry and the reality are often quite disconnected. And I think, projects like this can help to address that. And in a way, I see also my role sort of translating. But I think, there also has to be a big sort of, dose of realism in this, because ultimately, I think, we can all aim for lovely pilots and try new things, and that is important. But ultimately, isn't this about mainstreaming? I mean, the problems are just too big that we could rely on, here's a lovely range of new pilots that have been tested somewhere. I think a fundamental question needs to be how all of this, including climate, nature-based solutions, can be mainstreamed so that it could eventually become, almost like standard practice. And I think sometimes, I'm not dismissing the need for having innovative approaches, but sometimes that's almost becoming as a default. Something is difficult, well, let's try and do a pilot. Let's see how it could work. Great pilot, and then it just sits somewhere. So I think let's not forget the mainstream looks very different, and how could we integrate this into the mainstream? So I not only praised Jonathan's flood risk garden, I also hijacked two of his slides here. So as part of that first phase, we looked at different options here, what actually urban natural flood risk management could look like. Again, I'm not going to go into detail, but I hope you all have a sort of sense. I mean, presumably many of you live in an urban environment and might appreciate the natural environment that surrounds you, might even have seen how it can absorb floodwater and play an important role. I certainly have. When my basement got flooded, I started talking to the council, and I was assured that they were investing in sustainable urban drainage scheme, which they have. But so that's kind of what we're talking about. Barriers, very important to flag them. And I just want to say one aspect that can't really be underestimated, and this came up, I think, in your presentation. I think in both your presentations is the trust. Like, I mean, if you're putting a lot of money in this, I mean, let's assume you're a local authority, you understand there's a flood problem, you need to do something. You might even know where the money comes from. You might be lucky and your national government is giving you funds to do it. So what triggers you then to say, rather than going down the standard route, I go for nature-based solutions? That is, I think here in the room, we could give them 20, 30 good reasons to do it. But I think there is still a fundamental question around trust. Is it really going to work? Is it going to be quick? And will people, give me praise if I do it, or what happens if it doesn't? Yeah, and we shouldn't forget that. I mean, that comes up, I think, a lot in conversations. There are then other sort of more detailed question, and I think some of this is representative of what many of you will see in your communities, and lack of resources, guidance, the coordination aspect we mentioned earlier. And I think the question that we then, when we sort of worked our way through that, the question was, okay, well, what can we make of this other than say, look, it's difficult. Yes, insurance might have a role, could encourage, could share data, could maybe, fund an innovative new project. What could we do beyond that? And is there like a real business case? Is there an opportunity that might actually change the way we go about this? And when we were looking for that, we kind of looked at these sort of different types of, are we looking for a new financial instrument? Are we looking for a change in regulation? Is there a new kind of community engagement, sort of equity consideration, or new digital technological solutions? We kind of went through all of them. And we actually had one of the partners is a digital AI, Trees AI partner. So, I think there's scope in all of those. And as I said, there are some good examples also elsewhere that one could possibly replicate. But then something interesting happened. Oh, we can skip that. Something interesting happened. There was a change in the regulation in England. I think it's England, or is it the whole of the UK? This applies to England, I think, England. So earlier this year, there was a so-called biodiversity net gain regulation introduced, which requires any property developer to make an investment in biodiversity. Sort of, it gets quite complicated. If you want to look it up, I'm definitely not the best one to explain how it works. But there's a requirement that basically puts the property developer on the hook for 30 years to make an investment. It's a 10% biodiversity net gain requirement. They can do it on site, they can do it off site, or if they can't do any of those, they could potentially buy some credits. So it's a new scheme. It was introduced, it's mandatory. And first of all, it raised, I can tell you this, it raised, a lot of surprise. I don't think many of my colleagues saw it coming. And I think it suddenly is something material because there's a requirement. So we started discussing this in the context of our innovation lab, saying, look, if this is happening, is there a way that we could link biodiversity and nature-based solutions and sort of have these investments supporting both biodiversity and urban flood risk management? So, I actually have a slide. I should have known about this. So if you are interested in the regulation, which is really, as I said, it's quite new. I don't think it would be interesting to see if there is actually something similar that's been applied in other parts of the world. The interesting thing is, there's long liability, so 30 years. So you make an investment and you're on the hook. You have to show to the regulator that you're maintaining it, that this actually does what it's supposed to do. So that has triggered discussions with property developers and their insurers saying, is there some form of insurance that can help us if something goes wrong? I mean, 30 years and investing this in a reforestation scheme. I mean, it just triggered a lot of suddenly very specific and very detailed conversations. And I think it's an entry point. And I think what we're trying to do with the Innovation Lab is to see how we could basically take advantage of that and add urban flood risk management to the mix. I will skip this. So what we then sort of did, and it's still sort of work in progress and we haven't concluded this, but we are now sort of looking for, well, examples of, first of all, where can biodiversity net gain be linked to urban flood risk management? I think there's currently one case. I think Jonathan, you mentioned, I think in Hull, they have apparently been trying this. So that's our next point of call, because we're talking to local authorities. So we hopefully want to learn from them. And then I think there's a whole range of questions related to this, where we hopefully through the Innovation Lab can produce some guidance, first of all, also raise awareness, but then ideally also, make this, an example of how you can combine, how you can be specific enough to address your underlying problem, biodiversity, but broad enough to harness, co-benefits and design it in a way that it then addresses other urban challenges. So that is the challenge we've set ourselves. And one suggestions I would like to make to the wider NATURANCE community is, by definition, it's a European-focused project. And I think we have heard, JoAnne, you mentioned this, there's obviously a lot going on elsewhere as well. And I think interestingly, I think we even have participants from the US here. I think it would be really good if, as part of NATURANCE, we could also facilitate that sort of exchange with projects there. And I've just referenced some here. I don't know how relevant mangrove forests are for an urban flood risk setting in the UK, obviously not, but there are lots of other analogies where I think there is a lot of common ground, and that's a little bit my suggestion for NATURANCE, that we kind of look beyond our borders, not necessarily in terms of running new innovation labs, but learning from those projects that are ongoing, which have also a strong focus on engineering. And maybe that's the last thing I want to mention. I think ultimately we shouldn't forget there are people who actually will have to deliver this. And, sort of that is, I've heard this many times where people are saying, oh, this sounds all very great, but we only have people who can deliver the traditional way of flood risk management, and they've been trained to do that. So it would be interesting for me to understand whether that is a real barrier, whether that's something that could actually be changed, or what else could be done? Because I think if there's a skills issue, then I guess that could be another area for NATURANCE to look at.